weeks ago on Shabbat Night Live, we began an adventure with Nehemiah Gordon. I asked Nehemiah to come to Charlotte because I wanted to spend time with him, to catch up. It had been a year since we were together, and just the first evening together, for about 5 hours, he began laying things out that I said, okay, I didn't bring you in here to do any filming, but I can't let you go. We've got to get this on the air, and in preparation for Passover, in which Nehemiah Gordon is going to be with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, Nehemiah Gordon. Nehemiah.
Shalom, Michael. It's great to be here.
Well, we left off last week. We were talking about Martin Luther, about his book, The Lies of the Jews.
Well, he had the book, The Jews and Their Lies, and actually we quoted last week from the book, which was called Concerning Shem HaMeforash, which is concerning the Tetragrammaton, and he says things that are just horrific about God's holy name. Michael, on his birthday in 1938, there was a pivotal event in the history of European Jewry, which was called Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht 1938 is when the Germans, the Nazis, attacked Jewish homes and businesses. They famously smashed the glass of all the Jewish stores, and hence Kristallnacht is often translated as Night of the Broken Glass. On that night, November 9th going into November 10th, Martin Luther's birthday, they ransacked Jewish synagogues and seminaries and institutions all over Europe, and they gathered manuscripts into a central repository in Prague. And they established there what has been known as the Museum of the Extinct Race, because it was Hitler's purpose to make the Jews extinct. And he wanted future generations to see this is what this evil culture, the Jews that we've wiped out from his perspective, the evil Jews, this is what their books look like and their art. And isn't it wonderful we wiped them all out? That was Hitler's plan. And because of that, there was one of the books, and actually many of the books, were spared from Kristallnacht. They were not burned and destroyed. They were brought to this museum in Prague. And one of those was actually a manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew, what's called Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. I talked about that in my book, The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus.
That's right.
And actually this specific manuscript, the Breslau manuscript we talked about in the Open Door series that we did, 18 wonderful hours of teaching. And one of the things we looked at there in the Open Door series is where the Pharisees come and they ask Yeshua, what is the most important commandment of all? And he responds, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might and all your strength. And there's some ambiguity there when you compare the different Gospels in Greek and in English. And what I loved about this Breslau manuscript is there it says in Hebrew, V'ahavta et, and it has He, Hashem, representing Yud He Vav He, because a rabbi who copied this over the generations wouldn't put God's name Yehovah outside the Tanakh, essentially.
Right.
Even when they copied the Talmud, they put in He or Yud or some other representation, Yud Vav Yud. Or Yud Yud. So it's V'ahavta et Yehovah Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol me'odecha. So he says, he's quoting Deuteronomy 6:5 verbatim, and then he says, this is the first and the greatest of the commandments, and the second is like it. And in Hebrew, it's V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, which is from Leviticus 19. And then he says something really profound. Yeshua says something profound. V'al bet ha'ele ha'torah kula tluya v'hanevi'im. And upon these two, the entire Torah and the prophets hang. Now, when most Christians read that phrase, hang, I wonder if they really understand that there's a Hebrew idiom here, an idiom that any Jew would understand in the first century and any Jew who studied ancient Jewish sources would immediately recognize. And that idiom is this concept where hang there, what it really means is derive. And we have this example in rabbinical sources where they say, all the laws of the Sabbath, meaning all the laws of the Sabbath in rabbinical law, in the oral law, hang upon, are like they're like a mountain hanging by a thread. And what they mean by that is we have 2 or 3 little verses in the Tanakh, and out of that they derive a myriad of laws. And they're actually saying this almost in a way that's in some sense ironic, right? You wouldn't know about these without the oral law, meaning the rabbis made up a bunch of laws, and then they said you wouldn't know about these laws from the Torah because they're like a mountain hanging by a thread. And what Yeshua, and here's the point, when it says hang, what it means is they derive. In other words, when Yeshua says, upon these two commandments, the entire Torah and the prophets hang, it means the entire Torah and prophets derive. The central principle of all the Torah and the prophets is love Yehovah your God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And a Jew hears that, and it's just so plain and simple. Jews think in these terms. There's two types of commandments. Ben Adam lechavero, between a man and his fellow, between a human and his fellow human. Ben Adam lamakom, between a man, a human, and the Creator, the Eternal One. And so that's how Jews think about the commandments. They'll say, okay, Shabbat, that's between man and God. Don't steal, that's between man and man. And there's an element with God, right? Because God watches you, but it's something that doesn't, that hurts your fellow man. And so these are the two underlying principles of Jewish thought. And so when Yeshua brings these two verses, he just silences the Pharisees. They're just blown away by what he said. Now, they're blown away for another reason. And the other reason they're blown away, we don't know from Matthew, but we find this out when we read the verse in Mark. Because in Mark 12, 28 to 30, there's a slightly different expanded version, right? There's some words missing that we find in Mark. And in Mark, he doesn't start in Deuteronomy 6:5, love the Lord your God, love Yehovah your God. He starts in Deuteronomy 6:4. And there he quotes, Hear, O Israel, which in the Hebrew is Shema Yisrael, Yehovah Eloheinu, Yehovah Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yehovah is our God, Yehovah is one. And those are words that touch the heart of every Jew. I mean, they're so deeply ingrained in Jewish culture that they are literally, we are taught from the youngest age that those are the last words that you should speak on your lips before you die. And literally, there are stories you'll hear from people all the time that their grandmother, their grandfather, someone was on their deathbed and they were fading away, and they would stand with them and hold their hand and recite the Shema with them. And that is the most beautiful thing that a Jew can imagine, that as a person is passing on from this world, they proclaim, Yehovah is our God, Yehovah is one. I mean, those are just profound, really important words in the Jewish culture. And so for them to ask Yeshua, what is the most important commandment? And he starts with Shema Yisrael, Yehovah Eloheinu, Yehovah Echad. That would silence it would touch the heart of even the most stubborn Pharisee, deep in his soul. Through time, this verse became really even more important in Jewish culture. And I want to share something with the audience, Michael. We started talking about Kristallnacht, how the Nazis attacked the Jews. Well, we have this museum in Israel. It's not the museum of the extinct race. It's the museum of the race that's not extinct. It's called Yad Vashem. And Yad Vashem a phrase that comes from Isaiah 56. It talks about those who don't have children. Yehovah will raise them up and give them a yad, which means a monument, literally a hand, and a name greater than sons and daughters. And for all those Jews who were wiped out in the Holocaust, this memorial was established in Israel to remember them, to remember their names, this Yad Vashem. A few years back, Michael, I was at Yad Vashem, and I'm going through the museum, and I see something that blew me away, and I'm sure any Jew who sees this, it was blazoned across the wall, this quote from a rabbi who was going to his death in the gas chambers. And let me read you the quote. The rabbi turns to the Nazis, and he says, "Do not think you will succeed in destroying the Jewish people. The Jewish people will live forever." When the rabbi finished, he cried out emphatically, "Shema Yisrael!" And all the Jews cried out with him, "Shema Yisrael." I mean, there's no Jew who hears this and his heart is not touched. The dream and the aspiration of every Jew is the last words on your lips are to be Shema Yisrael. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And here this rabbi with his whole congregation going into the gas chambers, they were able to recite these words. And I remember being at Yad Vashem, and I saw this and I thought, how beautiful. But my second thought, Michael, was that can't possibly be true. How can that be true that this rabbi, just before he marched into the gas chambers, proclaimed Shema Yisrael with his congregation there? Even if it was true, how would we know it? And here I'm a conflicted person, Michael. I'll be the first one to admit that. On the one hand, I've had these God experiences, and those are deeply profound and important to me. On the other hand, I've been trained to look at things like a Litvak and as an academic and So, here's how I describe it to people. I wear two hats. My one hat is the hat of faith, and my other hat is the hat of skepticism, of inquiry and scholarship. And I know how to distinguish between the two hats. When I go to a Bible conference for academics, I leave my faith at the door, and I interact with everyone the way that they're all interacting, which is these are the raw, unadulterated facts. That if you could be a Christian, a Catholic, a Jew, an atheist, anybody could look at the same facts and come to the same conclusion. But I also am a man of faith outside of that academic context. And I saw these words on the Yad Vashem about the rabbi saying Shema Yisrael, and I thought, there's no way that's true. And as much as I want to believe it, this has to be a folk tale, because how would we know?
Right.
Who reported this? The rabbi's dead. His congregation's dead. Did the Nazis tell us that the rabbi recited Shema Yisrael? Did they even know what he...
Not likely.
Didn't make any sense. And I became very kind of skeptical, but I decided if this is untrue, I need to expose it and ask Yad Vashem to take it down from the National Holocaust Memorial, because we want the truth to be there in this museum.
Right.
And nothing but the truth. And if it is true, I want to be able to verify that as well. And I spent years researching this, Michael. This was a little project I had on the side. Time to time, I would be digging up, reading articles about the Holocaust and the history. And I found out, Michael, there was this thing called the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando were these people whose job it was, they were Jews who were kept alive for a short period to collect the bodies from the gas chambers, pile them up on carts, strip them of any property they had. And I'm talking, I don't even know how I can tell your audience it was their job to pull teeth, gold teeth, and to cut hair that was then recycled and then burn the bodies. And I thought, well, okay, so maybe the Sonderkommando preserved this story, but they were all killed, or so I thought at the time. So how could we know about this incident of what happened there? And I want to back up to give you a little bit of a context of why I was so skeptical that this rabbi, because this is really your I'm going to call it the paradigmatic martyr story, right? This is your ultimate martyr story. The Jew's about to go into the gas chamber, and he calls out Shema Yisrael, and the congregation responds to Shema Yisrael, and they go to their deaths. This is the proverbial Christians being eaten by lions story, right? This is the ultimate martyr story for Jews. And so I want to read you the story of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is a famous rabbi who was put to death by the Romans around the year 135 at the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And it's described in the Talmud. It says, when they brought forth Rabbi Akiva for execution, it was the time for the reciting the Shema. And what it means there is it says in the Shema, and if you read the whole passage in Deuteronomy 6, it says, you will speak about them when you lie down and when you get up. The rabbi said that means every night when you go to sleep, you are to recite the Shema, and every day when you wake up in the morning, you recite the Shema. And look, this is something I grew up doing. Every night reciting the Shema, every morning and I actually still recite the Shema every day. Right? I don't take it necessarily literally the way it was taken literally by the rabbis, but I say, okay, maybe that's not what God commanded literally, but what a beautiful thing to recite these words. Hear, O Israel, Yehovah is our God, Yehovah is one, and you shall love Yehovah your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, etc. So it says when Rabbi Akiva was being taken out to be executed, it was the time of the reciting of the Shema. And it says, as the Romans were combing his flesh with iron combs, right? So they literally skinned this rabbi alive. He was receiving upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And that phrase, receiving upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, is Jewish phraseology. That's a Jewish idiom that means he was reciting the Shema, which is really interesting. We could have some New Testament discussions about that as well, maybe. But this phrase, receiving upon yourself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, he was reciting the Shema. Rabbi Akiva's disciple said to him, even now? Like now you're being skinned alive and you're reciting the Shema? Rabbi Akiva said to them, all my days I was troubled by the verse, with all your soul, right? Because it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Mm-hmm. I was troubled by the verse with all your soul, which means even if it costs you your life. I said to myself, when will I have the opportunity to fulfill this? This is a rabbi being skinned alive by the Romans, and he's thinking, there's a verse I didn't get to fulfill. Oh, now I can fulfill it. And now that I have the opportunity, should I not fulfill it? He elongated his pronunciation of echad, of one, until his soul left him. So we have this deeply rooted Jewish tradition of reciting the Shema as the last words. And here, this Rabbi Akiva, he was able to fulfill that. And there are Jews throughout history who have done this. Even in modern times, we have documented examples, right? I'm skeptical of what happened in the Holocaust, and we'll get to that. We'll find out if that really happened or not. But we have modern examples that are indisputable. There's an example of an Israeli commander who was in the war in Lebanon. And I mean, it's a moving story, because this was an Israeli commander who had a wife and children, and he was there with his soldiers, and a terrorist threw a grenade amongst his soldiers. And the commander jumped on the grenade, covered it with his stomach. And the grenade went off. And he radioed it to headquarters, telling the headquarters, I'm dying. Shema Yisrael, Yehovah, of course he said Adonai, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. As his life breath went out, and he was surrounded by witnesses, surrounded by soldiers who recounted the story that this Israeli commander said the Shema as he was dying, following the example of Rabbi Akiva, following the example of many Jewish martyrs throughout history. And so because this is so deeply embedded in Jewish culture, I had to ask the question, is this a true story? Or is this just a fable we're telling people about the Holocaust? We shouldn't be telling stories that aren't true about the Holocaust, because there's enough truth there to sustain us and understand what happened. And so I had to ask the skeptical question. So I began to investigate, Michael, and I found out there was something that scholars call the Scrolls of Auschwitz. The Scrolls of Auschwitz is a series of documents. There's, depending on how you count them, approximately 9 caches of documents that were found at Auschwitz. And there were others found in other places, but specifically at Auschwitz, there were these caches of documents and diaries and letters. And these diaries and letters were mostly written by these Jewish Sonderkommando. These were the people whose job it was to clean up the bodies. Their job it was to cut the hair and pull the teeth and put the bodies in the ovens. And there's horrific things described in these diaries that they wrote. And then I began to ask the question, is it possible the story about the rabbi reciting the Shema before he went to his death with his congregation, could that have come from these scrolls of Auschwitz? And I made it my mission to find the answer to this question. I read every book there was in Hebrew. I read books in English. There was one book in Yiddish that I had to have translated because, I don't read Yiddish. Parts of it were translated. And I found things, Michael, I didn't expect. Things that really shocked me. And here actually, I want to show the people what some of the scrolls of Auschwitz look like. Because Michael, you think, how could something have survived the Holocaust like this? What happened is they burned the bodies of the Jews, and there were mountains of ash, mounds and mounds of ash, and they put those ashes into pits. And then the procedure was they would take the ashes from the pits every once in a while, put them on a truck and dump them in the river, in the Vistula River. So some of these Jews said, hey, if it's picked up in the river, it might survive in a bottle. And so one of these is like put in a canteen, in like a makeshift canteen. And it turns out it survived not because it was in the river, but because they never got around to, because the Nazis were losing the war, they never got around to putting that pile of ash in the river. And there's one account of these Polish forestry students who came to do some cleaning up at Auschwitz because it gets overrun with the forest. Right, the forest is encroaching on this historical site. And as they're pulling weeds, they find these documents, right? And so these documents were found all the way from 1945 up until relatively recent times. They still continue to find some of these documents, these scrolls of Auschwitz. I actually did a teaching on my website, nehemiaswall.com, called The Lost Scrolls of Auschwitz, because we don't have all the documents. And I think we need to remember what happened here. And in the second half, I want to share with people what were found in these lost scrolls of Auschwitz and how deeply these Jews were connected to God's holy name and sanctifying his name.